and welcome to week 2 of the Shakespeare Hour by the Shakespeare Theatre Company online. This is part of Shakespeare Everywhere, our new web series of online content. I am Drew Lichtenberg. I am the literary manager and dramaturg here at the Shakespeare Theatre. I'm joined by my co-host, our artistic director, Simon Godwin.
Hello.
Hello, Simon. Each week we are going to be examining the world of Shakespeare and our own by discussing 2 plays from the canon which speak to each other thematically, dramaturgically, historically. And we are going to have special guests, internationally recognized theater artists who are also friends of STC. In Shakespeare's lifetime, the theaters were often closed due to the plague, so our first 3 sessions are looking at plays that were written either just during or just after these closures. Tonight's theme is Ghosts and the Law, and we will be looking at Hamlet and Measure for Measure. A quick announcement at the top, we were going to be joined by Yael Farber, the Helen Hayes Award-winning director of Salome at the Shakespeare Theatre and next season's Les Blancs. Yael, unfortunately, is dealing with a medical emergency at home in Montreal, so our thoughts are with her right now. We're hoping that we can reschedule her for another week, hopefully. And we're happy to announce that we have found a last-minute replacement who I will be introducing shortly, in fact, presently. Our guests are Jonathan Cake, who has appeared on TV in Desperate Housewives and The Affair most recently, as well as Simon Godwin's production at Theatre for a New Audience of Measure for Measure, where he played the Duke of Dark Corners. Hello, Jonathan.
Hi, hello, Drew.
And joining us last minute, thank you, Cara Ricketts, who was Isabella in that production of Measure for Measure. So we have a sort of miniature cast reunion tonight.
Yeah.
And before we get started with the sort of more formal part of the conversation, I want to mention 2 functions as part of this Zoom webinar, the chat function and the Q&A function. The Q&A is for questions that you want to ask us, and the chat is if you have thoughts, comments that you want to share with the whole world of everybody watching. So we would like to thank all of you who have tuned in, all of our members and our subscribers. You are STC's support network, and you help make all of this possible. So, Simon, what Shakespeare character do you feel like tonight?
Well, thank you, Drew. And thank you to echo Drew's gratitude to everybody that's joining us tonight. Heroically, you're back for week 2. Week 1 was had some challenges. You'll remember how I dropped off 3 minutes into the first episode. So I'm already excited that I made it past the 3rd minute. You'll see behind me there's an interesting view because I'm actually in Rectortown United Methodist Church this evening, which has been specially socially distanced for me to come with apparently impeccable internet here in Virginia. So I'm really ready to stay the course. Which Shakespeare character do I feel like tonight with all of you? Well, I guess I feel a little bit like Polonius this evening because I'm hoping that I don't talk too much and that I get my point across, but worried that my verbosity might undo me.
And you're also an accomplice to high treason, right? But you're not telling us which
well,
crime.
Who knows? That might become clear as the evening goes on.
Jonathan, Cara, what Shakespeare characters are you feeling like tonight?
The only one that comes to me is the fool from King Lear, or indeed, any of the fools. I just feel like it would be nice to make a point without feeling like I was wearing a hat with bells on.
I feel like the first fairy in Midsummer, the one that Puck runs into. I literally just ran back in from the grocery store, mask on, hat on, everything. So I'm very happy to be here. And I think there'll be moments where I'm like, hey, I remember that. I remember that. Much like the fairy goes, Puck, I remember you.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, intimate scene right there between Puck and the first fairy.
Yeah, it's nice.
Before us. Well,
I also like that they're really busy in the beginning. Like, yeah, I'm into you, but I'm too busy to talk to you.
Right. They have a kind of like relationship that's off stage, a whole subtext. Well, any of you who feel like they feel like a specific Shakespeare character, please use the chat function, and we may read those throughout the hour if they're especially tasty or delicious. So now we come to Ghosts in the Law, more specifically Hamlet and Measure for Measure. And these 2 plays are written at an interesting juncture in Shakespeare's life and career. Just a few dates that I want to read first off. In 1596, Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, dies from the plague. A few years later, his father dies. In 1603, James Stuart becomes the King of England. And these two plays are written roughly during that juncture. The first quarto of Hamlet, the bad quarto, so-called, was published in 1603, the year of James's first year of his reign. And Measure for Measure, most people date it to 1603 or 1604. So troubling times, personally, politically, reflected in the tension in these two plays. So I'd like to ask all of our guests how Shakespeare deals with these tensions, these abstract forces that are troubling him. Specifically, how does he deal with rationality and irrationality in these two plays? I think, Jonathan, we'll start with you.
Okay, well, I hope you don't mind, and thank you very much for having me tonight. It's so nice to be able to talk about these plays. I have been longing for those things that remind us of a time before this odd moment we're living through, and those things that sort of feel timeless. So to lose myself in these two extraordinary plays has been just a balm. So I am afraid to say, being a slightly dull-witted, I wrote my thoughts out on rationality and irrationality, and I hope you won't mind me referring to my notes. So I started off by thinking about taking the title of the talk at face value. It seems sort of obvious that the play with the ghost, the one with the antic disposition, real or faked, the one that deals with poisoning and incest and with so many wild and whirling words, and that ends with the stage piled high with dead bodies, Hamlet, might be the play in the irrational corner tonight. And equally, that the other play that riffs in its title on the scales of justice, or the Old Testament's eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth system of punishment, and is partly a 3-hour disquisition on mercy, justice, and in the opening line of the play, of government, the properties to unfold, which I had to say every night as the Duke. And anybody who can hook an audience with that opening line is doing well. It's quite dry.
Yeah, it's one of the most difficult speeches to open.
Yeah, tricky, but I'll get to why I think it's amazing and why the writing of it is particularly interesting to me. What Stephen Greenblatt called Shakespeare's strategic opacity, which I think is such a great phrase. Why he doesn't explain things and what's dramatically fruitful about that. So we might think that that play, Measure for Measure, might be the one that's squarely representing rationality tonight. But I, as always with Shakespeare, I'd like to argue that it's a bit more complicated, and that the two plays have a number of surprising similarities as well as some obvious differences. I'd like to sort of broadly argue that Hamlet actually is defined as a character and as a play by being a slave to his rationality, someone who is really enthralled to his own mind, his own rational mind. Just as I would like to argue that the pilot light that's heating Measure for Measure is that greatest of irrational motivations, sex. There are some similarities. Both plays exist in a state of profound claustrophobia. In Measure for Measure, there's no, unlike many other comedies, there's no fresh air to breathe. There's no Forest of Arden to escape to. There's no Belmont. There's only the oppressively enclosed spaces of prisons, brothels, cloisters, rooms of government, where men can get away with whatever they think they want to with young women. Even Angelo's garden, which is the only green space that's mentioned in the play, is described as circummured, which I think is a wonderful word, and an interesting word because it's a word that Shakespeare invented specifically for the play. It didn't exist before, and he never uses it again. It means, of course, walled in or enclosed, and it's a perfect description of the emotional as well as the actual landscape of the play. And Denmark, of course, famously is a prison. Elsinore is the surveillance center of this police state. People listen at keyholes. Friends are sent to spy on other friends. Faces are scrutinized for incriminating reactions. There's no fresh air to be had in Elsinore either. I think there are some interesting ways in which Measure for Measure, written sort of approximately 5 years later, 1599, 1603, 4, kind of grows out of Hamlet, which sounds a little bit like blasphemy to people who think justifiably that Hamlet is the greatest example of Shakespeare's genius, and that Measure for Measure is a sort of, you know, difficult child. Dover Wilson, the critic, described him as a problem child. They're both problem children, but he described Hamlet as being the problem child that is interesting and complex and will grow up to have a wonderful life, as opposed to Measure for Measure, which is just a problem child you can't really do anything with. But I would say that there's something I'd like to justify, that while Angelo, I think, is an interesting theatrical creation that grows sort of out of the promptings of Claudius in Hamlet, that Angelo and Claudius are both hypocrites, men of action, they're both surrogates, they're both usurpers, they're both sex criminals. I would argue that Angelo is the greater theatrical creation. And while it might seem like some irrationality of my own to claim that Measure for Measure is a better play than Hamlet, I do want to make a case for why it's just as interesting. For example, take death. Both plays are obsessed with death. But in Hamlet's case, the critical death in the play is nostalgic. It's a death that's happened before the play starts. Hamlet Senior is murdered before it begins, and it sets in train the deep theme of looking back in the play and the extreme problem the hero has with moving forward. In Measure for Measure, the theatrical momentum is all forward-looking. The play begins, the Duke's got to get out. An innocent man is sentenced to death, and a young trainee nun and a Duke with opaque motives dressed as a friar only have 24 hours to save him. It's really like a police procedural, and a good production of the play, thank you, Simon, should give you a really visceral thrill at the ticking clock that's enshrined in the play and the enormous stakes of it. And it's interesting to look at the way Hamlet, the Duke, and Claudio in Measure for Measure discuss death, to see that the plays are crucially different in the way they make us feel about death. And you can argue one might be an evolution of another, or whatever takes your fancy. I would, but I'm not sure I'm going to persuade many people. Of course, To Be or Not to Be is the most famous speech in the English language, but maybe I can remind us of why it's so famous. I would argue it's because the language is so literally and metaphorically dreamy, obsessed with dreaming. And Drew, did you want us to read these little chunks here to back up this argument, or are we saving the chunks for later?
Yeah, I think to use your beautiful phrase, I think we can save the chunks for later. But you certainly give us a lot to think about, to ponder, to respond to. So let's pause. Let's put a pin in that speech for just a second.
Not the first dramaturg that's told me that, Drew.
Not the first?
Not the first.
Oh,
no.
okay. So
Q&As are often like, good, can we just move on, Jonathan? Great.
Not at all. No, I think we want to stew and marinate in this heavy broth of ideas. And yeah, you raise a number of interesting parallels between the two works. Certainly, both of these plays have the element of the panopticon in them, this idea that we are in a world where we are being watched at all times, one that is really sort of the worst form of imprisonment, one that can drive a person mad. So there's this very active tension between rationality and irrationality. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A. We're happy to answer those as we go along. But I want to sort of turn it over to Simon to respond to Jonathan, and maybe to tell us how he sees these two plays being in conversation.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. That's I love your point about one being the kind of the thrill, the thriller quality of Measure for Measure, and how if Hamlet is about meditation and thoughtfulness, Measure is about urgency and deciding, and the stakes being toweringly high. And we know that, I think, as we talk about over these episodes, what makes Shakespeare great, we could certainly say that high stakes is one of them. That is something that distinguishes him as a playwright. He's addicted to the highest stakes possible. The other thing I found myself thinking about when I was approaching you all this evening was this question of inner conflict. That Shakespeare loves an idea of making the challenge of a character to bring together opposing parts of themselves. So in Measure for Measure, of course, as Johnny says, it's a supremely claustrophobic world, which also people are trying at the beginning to take themselves away from. So the Duke is meant to be ruling Vienna, but he decides to abdicate and hide. Angelo, the ruler that he puts in his place, has devoted his life to study and precision and the law and repressed relationships. Isabella is setting off to join a very strict convent at the beginning. And yet by the end of the play, the Duke has got thoroughly involved in the cesspit of Viennese life. Angelo has almost been entirely undone by lust and murderous thoughts. And Isabella has left the convent never to return. In fact, to get married to the Duke. So as soon as someone takes a strong position in a Shakespeare play, it's very likely by the end of the play, they will have come and entirely changed that position. Now, to talk about rationalism and irrationalism, certainly in Hamlet, here I think is a very different thesis about how to bring those two things together. Hamlet at the beginning is faced with a challenge. As Johnny says, the ghost of his father comes back and says, I have been killed, I have been murdered by your uncle. Take revenge on my behalf. And Hamlet, of course, goes into a very rational disposition about how should he do this? And also, who should he trust? Is the ghost a devil, as he wonders, as he speculates? And so he gets into lots of rational stratagem. For example, putting on a play to try and see whether his uncle is in fact guilty. But then as the play goes on, a new feeling, a new way of thinking emerges. Hamlet, of course, goes to England. He returns, having killed Polonius, and he returns to discover that Ophelia has died, most likely a suicide. And we have this extraordinary section towards the end of the play when he starts talking to his friend Horatio and says, no longer, I want to be rational or irrational. He says there's a divinity that shapes our ends. Rough hew them how we will. And in this very intense passage, I actually played Hamlet when I was 17 in my school play. And these are the few lines that I have managed to remember. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The readiness is all. So to answer his earlier question, to be or not to be, he says in the same scene, let be. And he's able to step into a kind of new river of calm. And this man who is so destroyed by confusion and overthinking of thinking too precisely over the event, as he puts it, has by the end of the play reached a kind of resignation, which allows him, in fact, to take revenge for his father. But in doing so, in those very last moments of his life, in fact, the very last words Hamlet says before he dies are, the rest is silence. He finds an integration, an accommodation, and a peacefulness, which is very, I would say, unique in all the characters of Shakespeare.
And in fact, the line he says right after let be is, there is a special providence in the fall of a sparrow, which means there is God in all things, which you can take in an explicitly Christian sense or in a more existential sense of what will be, will be. You can drive yourself mad trying to control the world, or you can give yourself over to action.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about that passage, Simon, is it's a late revision by Shakespeare, or at least in my opinion.
I didn't know that, Drew. Okay.
Because I believe it's in the folio edition of the play and not in any of the quartos, although somebody in the comments may correct me on that. But I believe he cuts the Act 4 soliloquy, how all occasions do inform against me, and he inserts that crucial scene between him and Horatio. So
well, it seems to define the play for me. But Johnny wants to come in with something there.
I do. No, I was just trying. I didn't actually, Simon. But now you've mentioned it. I don't need any second invitation. I was just trying to think aloud whether that's true. Whether you're claiming that it's a unique piece, accommodation of peace before death in Shakespeare. Perhaps you're right. I was just thinking about the dying Mark Antony, and
good.
He has made a sort of accommodation with his own absurd mortality and gone beyond his myth. You know, his own self-mythologization.
Yes.
Yes,
You're right, Johnny. Actually, that's right. That was perhaps a too bold a claim on my part, but I think that because you're right to remind me that death is a character in Shakespeare. It's somehow when death arrives, he brings with him, or brings with her, a sort of self-knowledge, which the characters have lacked there too. And I think your point about Mark Antony, a character I think you've played is very accurate, as I recall it now, directing it as I did. But Drew, some comments from the audience.
I can't wait to get Cara into this, but we also have some questions to answer from our Q&A feature. One from Gregory Lasky, one from Peter Moskowitz, and one from Barbara Sirota. So I'll take those in order. Comment a bit on revenge as a tool for justice in these two plays. I wonder if the panelists hold the opinion that Shakespeare believed in the literal existence of ghosts. If not, is King Hamlet an unreliable narrator, the ghost in the play? And 3, define problem comedy, which I believe Jonathan used in his sort of introductory remarks. In what sense is Measure for Measure a comedy? It seems so dark and tragic and full of negative emotions.
Can I kick off on a couple of those, and then maybe the second two I feel were great questions. I discovered, again, preparing for tonight, that this term problem play that we bandy around a lot was actually coined in 1896 by a critic called F.S. Boas. And he said a problem play is one that has a kind of slipperiness and also a great concern or interest in paradox. And I think what is so challenging and interesting about Measure for Measure and about Hamlet is that they are very generically complicated. And I think the question is spot on about Measure for Measure. I remember Cara was speaking about this, and Johnny, when we were doing the play, the balance of comedy and tragedy, of darkness and light, was really hard to navigate. And I think for audiences, it was challenging. And I think that probably in the original Globe, audiences were much more comfortable with the comic and the tragic sitting side by side than today, when we like to try and divide territories in the play, languages in the play, much more tightly. I'll quickly speak about the ghost, and I'll hand over to Johnny and indeed to Cara. When I directed Hamlet for the Royal Shakespeare Company, I set it in West Africa. And one of the many reasons why we did that was that I went to West Africa when I was thinking about it, because I'd cast an amazing British actor who had Ghanaian heritage. And through talking to him, made me think I should go to West Africa. And in West Africa, I discovered that when you said to somebody, "Oh, I saw a ghost last night," they would say, "Where?" Not, "You're crazy, what are you talking about?" And I have a feeling that in Elizabethan England, ghosts were much more of a big deal. That people did take them seriously. And Hamlet actually worries not whether the ghost is real, but whether he's the devil. So I think there is a very strong level of belief in the play, in the afterlife, or in the supernatural, which we are much less in contact with today. And it was interesting setting it in a place where those things could come much more readily to life.
And indeed, the conversation between the first fairy and Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream, it's all these normal, quotidian, everyday things that they're doing. Curdling the milk and misleading night wanderers. It's this strange fusion of the everyday with the supernatural, which is evidence of your point that Shakespeare's audience thought of this every day. They thought of ghosts and spirits every day.
There's that great thing, of course, in Macbeth of putting the spells, the incantations on stage, when a lot of people in the audience would have known that there were, I want to say, 60 women burnt in the north of England the previous year for witchcraft. The idea that this was real, that this was something deeply, deeply scary and flammable, you know. I'm curious about that thing about the ghost being an unreliable narrator is such an interesting idea. It's such a fascinating thing to me that Shakespeare shows us that people can see him at the beginning of the play, but Gertrude can't see him in the closet. I've always thought that was really fascinating, the way he forces the ghost inside Hamlet's head, rather than in Macbeth again, where he is, the ghost of Banquo is immediately internal to Macbeth and to nobody else. It's a very clear delineation, but in Hamlet, it changes.
Cara, I'm dying to hear your thoughts on these questions. Come in, and others.
Well, one of the first things that I think about I'm not sure if we were pitting the two plays against one being rational versus one being irrational, but I've always found it interesting how something that could have started out as rational becomes irrational due to secret intentions. Like I think of Ophelia's last speech with the flowers when she's about to go kill herself, and she walks in and she's like, here's rosemary for remembrance, and everybody's like, what's wrong with this chick? But she's actually saying goodbye and being as rational in a super abstract way. And so many characters in this play, or both plays rather, start off with a rational ideal or idea that goes one step too far and becomes irrational, I think. And so I find that kind of interesting. I was also wondering, like, when do we start going into Blackfriars? Isn't it part of, like, after, from getting away from the plague and everything? So the plays would have been indoors, hence the feeling of that claustrophobia and you know, internal, inwards looking thing. And also, as someone who's going through a form of a plague right now, these ideas seem far more close to home than they would have before. The idea of meditating and like the idea of the cloister and going into a place and examining my personal self, although I don't think that's entirely why Isabella did that. But those kind of choices of like, I'm going to go outside and put on my mask and da-da-da-da-da. Is that person sick? Is that person sick? My choices are now defined from a defensive place. And so the idea of rational and irrational while also being in the play, I can personally understand it a bit more in a way that I don't think I would have before.
And I believe it's the votarists of St. Clair in Measure for Measure, which is the strictest and most repressive Catholic nunnery in Europe.
Yes. And oddly enough, the second we went into quarantine, I'm like, what do they do? Because I now have an entire day that isn't blocked out for me in terms of events or anything. So I need someone else to tell me what to do, you know? And funnily, like when we were doing Measure for Measure, I always felt that Isabella had found a cheat code, if you will, like this kind of way out of a society that she didn't know how to participate in or didn't want to participate in. And so the way to do that was to get thee to a nunnery. And all of that kind of safety and freedom that she has, she then gets kicked out of because of her brother, you know?
I just realized that Hamlet says, get thee to a nunnery to Ophelia. And then in this play, we see that happen.
Yeah.
What happens when you go to the nunnery and you get pulled out of it?
You don't last very long. I mean, that's the thing about Shakespeare. It's like
in fact, I think her first lines are there any more stricter measures that you can put me through? And then she's forced to speak to Lucio because she's not a full nun yet, so she's allowed to speak to men.
Right.
So she's halfway to being a nun, but a novice. She's not a full nun.
Yes. And then oddly in this place of safety, because as being a nun, she can go to like Angelo's office. I mean, taking a chance to do that the same way, but she doesn't need she doesn't need someone there to watch her, which is also interesting with Ophelia, like Laertes and her father. She goes, I think this guy likes me. We're not even sure whether or not she's into Hamlet, but they immediately are like, follow it through, find what you need to do. And because of that, her this kind of what could have started out as love, which then becomes a goal that's been put on her by her father and her brother, it becomes irrational. It doesn't become a real love. And so he reacts to her in his own irrational way. I can't speak anymore, but he then pursues her in a way that's no longer rational because he's also dealing with his father's death. And talk about ghosts, like Isabella and Claudio are dealing with a father and mother we don't see. And she makes reference of when he gives his Hamlet speech, where she's like, I hope to God, when he's like, you know, go sleep with the guy. And she's like, I hope that, you know, when my mother played my father fair so that she didn't beget like this slip of wilderness when she refers to her brother. And it's like things that are rational in the particular character's mind seems irrational because nobody else knows what the full game is. They don't know what the full story is.
We have one question that I'd like to hear from both Cara and Jonathan and also Simon on. But then we have to take a break because we've already been talking for 30 minutes, believe it or not.
Wow.
Question for Alison Westphal. Hello, Alison.
Hi, Alison.
Why are you sure Isabella marries the Duke at the end of the play? It seems the text is very unclear about this, and STC's most recent production left that question unanswered.
Love that question. Okay. Well, I'm going to say a few tiny things before I hand over to Jonathan, and then Cara on this. Well, welcome to my world, Alison. I mean, it's an interesting thing that I spend my whole life as a director trying to persuade actors to kind of justify strange outcomes at the end of Shakespeare plays. I would suggest that marriage in Shakespeare, I'm making a bold claim now, is a metaphor for integration, and that we take up isolated and extreme positions, and you meet somebody that pushes you out of your comfort zone and encourages you to become a bigger, wider, more open-hearted person. So one has to find a psychological truth to the decisions the character makes, and you have to find a kind of metaphorical truth for how the decisions are made. And that's a very interesting balancing act between the realistic and the poetic, let's say. And it's hard to achieve, but it's a real part of our work. Jolly.
No, it's an incredibly vexed question, of course, and one that's really one that every production of that play has to answer and make a good case for. I mean, it really is extraordinary what an incendiary creature Isabella is in the first half of the play, like the brain and the self-determining life force of a Beatrice or a Rosalind. And then how increasingly silent she gets in the play. That's just a representation of what she says, and how much more increasingly dominant the Duke becomes, the deus ex machina of what he's trying to work towards becomes. And it is a real conundrum for the play. I can only say that when we did it, two things. One was that procedural thing which I was talking about before, that sense of a plan that is being acted out against a ticking clock with the highest possible stakes, the execution of a brother, was, in the playing of it, felt very, very galvanizingly exciting. It felt very galvanizingly exciting for these two accomplices in this plan, for Isabella and the Duke. There's something I think that people neglect to talk enough about, I think, was that Shakespeare had this extraordinarily evolved sense of what works on stage, what the indefinable spell of something that's being created that doesn't need to be written down. And if my rather sort of laborious point about Hamlet being overwritten and Measure for Measure being, just written enough, is that so much of what he does is leave the riddle of that relationship to be worked out between these two actors who are playing these parts and the audience that they're complicit with. And so what we got to every night was this stage where I'm not quite sure whether you let us do this, Simon, but we sort of mutually agreed it between ourselves, perhaps I shouldn't be saying this now, is that if I hadn't convinced Cara as Isabella, to accept me at the end of the play, she wouldn't. And if I had convinced her, she would. So for us, it remained a sort of live, open-ended idea, a negotiation. And I think that seemed, certainly in the playing of it, the inhabiting of it, I don't know how you felt, Cara, but it felt reasonable. It felt like a reasonable question to ask every night. Is this okay? Is this enough? Do you accept me?
Yeah, is this a romantic comedy, right? Is the question, where she falls in love with the Duke.
I loved where we got to it, because every night there was that kind of frisson. I don't know if you can feel it in the audience. We could definitely feel it as a cast each night, whether or not I would decide to take Jonathan's hand as the Duke and Isabella. And I think that's important. I think being able to, and that's Simon's doing, like, truly, the fact that we were able to create every night this kind of vibration of, like, is this the night that I decide to walk off stage and we have an ending that we've never really tried before? Ultimately, I felt that if I were to break away, which might be saying something about the character, if Cara, decided to walk away from the stage that night, it was no longer a comedy in the way that I felt like, the way that I've been told a comedy was. Everybody's supposed to live happily ever after, no matter how crazy everything is. And I also felt that if she were to leave, her hero's journey and the hero's journey of all those other characters and the growth that's supposed to be taking place within them, at least for our production in the time that we had put it up, just wouldn't seem right. Like, it's a hypersexualized world, and Isabella's the complete opposite of that. And then, like, I think all those characters are supposed to come together in order to create a whole world. And at the point, what they're going through is incredibly broken, which is why they all end up on the journeys that they end up on. So I didn't tell Jonathan at the time, but I was going to be there every night. We were going to get married every night.
Terrifying.
I thought I was persuading you night after
Yeah,
night.
you were. I was totally persuaded.
Yeah. And of course, in classical terms, a comedy is a play in which people marry at the end. That's what Aristotle says a comedy is. So,
but I don't.
It's a comedy, and yet it also is one where people die.
But I don't think necessarily taking my hand indicates. I don't think necessarily taking my hand indicates that that's it. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about these plays, as you were talking about, you know, the Fairy and Puck having this offstage life, the sense of a continuum, that there's still a lot of questions to ask and a lot of living to be done and a lot of wounds to heal. I mean, I thought that was very alive in that production in a great way. I thought the sense of the real natural stickiness of life continuing was very palpable, and I think Shakespeare allows for that to happen, particularly in these problem plays that don't seem like they fit the perfect box description of what a comedy should be.
Wow, we have so many more questions on this theme. It's clear that we've hit a rich ore of discussion, which we will be returning to soon. Simon, you have a comment?
No. I'm excited, and I'm looking forward to the questions. This is great. This is my dream of the radio show.
But first, we want to take a quick pause. Thank everyone who tuned in last week to watch the National Theatre at Home broadcast of Simon's 2017 production of Twelfth Night. And you can go to the National Theatre's YouTube page and still watch that production until, is it tomorrow afternoon? Okay, I think that's right. On May 7th, the National Theatre will also be broadcasting Simon's production of Antony and Cleopatra, starring Ralph Fiennes and Sophie Okonedo, some familiar names. And there's a trailer that we want to share with you right now. So can we roll that film?
If it be love indeed, tell me, how much?
There's beggary in the love that can be reckoned.
He calls me boy, and chides as he had power to beat me out of Egypt.
Sink Rome, and let their tongues rot that speak against us.
Oh, whither hast thou led me, Egypt?
Looks like an epic production, to be sure. That production will be available from May 7th to May 14th via the National Theatre's YouTube page. And Simon, are you doing a chat, a pre-show chat for that show as well?
Yes, we were trying to sing for 12th Night, but of course, after my extraordinary technological challenges of last week on the Shakespeare episode 1, famously as referred to already tonight at the 3-minute drop-off, I was somewhat nervous about repeating it the following day. So the team are now working hard on how we can do indeed a live chat around Antony and Cleopatra, which will be a real pleasure to achieve and talk to everyone about. It's a production close to my heart, and it's great to see that footage. It really reminds me of it and rehearsing it.
And we'd also like to remind everybody about the Phoenix Fund. Simon, do you want to talk about the Phoenix Fund for a second?
Yes, I'm extremely happy to talk about the Phoenix Fund. I'm sure many of you are receiving my weekly update videos, which essentially are celebrating everyone's great support, faith, and kindness as we raise money to support the theatre and to look after our staff through this period. I'm really thrilled to say, and this will be announced tomorrow in my next video, that we have currently raised, with your help, $865,000. which is incredible. And what's even as incredible is we have a very visionary board member who is matching every dollar that we raise. So that's an incredible sum of money. And we're trying to get to $1 million. And so every amount that folks give make a huge difference. So I'm enormously grateful, and on behalf of the whole Shakespeare Theatre Company, we're amazed and really grateful and thrilled.
All right, well, we want to get to those speeches that Jonathan was talking about before, but first we have these questions about these infamous cruxes at the ends of these plays, involving marriage, involving sexuality, involving indeed rationality and irrationality. Lynn Sukup asks, why would Isabella not be happy returning to what appears to be sincere religious devotion? And Patricia Gallagher has the same question. Couldn't Isabella's happy ending be to go back to the convent or to be single?
See, I think it could be, yes, it could be Isabella's happy ending. But is it the happy ending for measure? Like, is it the happy ending? Is that how we tie this entire thing back together again? You know, it has to go, I think, in order for the change to take place, it is a marriage of morals and justice. It's literally the Duke and religion come together in hopes of changing the world that they were in, which was before kind of bawdy and irresponsible, you know? And also it leads to the kind of judgment where her brother, who is in love with a woman and has sex with her, like outside of the law, and gets in trouble for it. Now, if you're in a place where we're making those choices, where if the Duke were to make those choices with someone like Isabella at his side, we're looking at it from a more moral place. Like, we're just, it's a bit, for me, it's more about just bringing everything together so that it can be more whole. It's a more wholesome situation at the end.
You mentioned Claudio, Isabella's brother, and it's always struck me that the woman he has impregnated is named Juliet in the play. And it's almost like Shakespeare, just like he's showing the aftermath of the get thee to a nunnery scene, he's also showing what would happen if Romeo and Juliet did elope. And, you know, if Juliet got knocked up and they had this child out of wedlock, and what would the consequences of that be? It's a more complicated play in terms of the issues that it's working through than Romeo and Juliet and Midsummer Night's Dream, in a way. Jonathan, you look thoughtful, pensive.
No, I was just, that's my resting face when I'm trying to figure out these big and knotty problems. Isabella is such a fascinating character to me. I mean, part of the movement of the play, whether it's satisfying for everybody or not, whether it's completely satisfying, obviously it's been a problem for 450 years, but part of the movement of the play surely is away from absolutism and towards something that acknowledges that a system of government is like a human being. It has to acknowledge that it has feelings, that it has sensual feelings, that it has irrational feelings. And, you know, as you rightly pointed out about the votaries of St. Clair, they're the most strict religious order, and she wants more. She wants things to be stricter. At the beginning of the play, she says, more than our brother is our chastity. And she, you know, there is a way in which Angelo and Isabella's, the incredible intensity and force of the scenes they have together, you know, kind of unmatched in Shakespeare, I think, come from something to do with a similar nuclear fission that is firing from both of them, right? That is firing to do with that absolutism. And it's only, thank God, you know, poor Lucio gets a bad rap in this play, but it's only Lucio who saves Claudio's life by saying, you're too cold, stay, keep arguing, you know, turn this around. And in that arguing, in that dialectic becomes there's a sort of, I think there's the beginning of a movement away from seeing things in a way that, like a female Angelo would, towards something in a wider sense that's to do with real humanity, real mercy, real tenderness. And I think that the movement of the play is further and further and further towards that. Whether you buy where it ends or not, I think acknowledging that human beings are not machines and are not, the law consequently and government can't be that either, is a crucial part of what makes the play so great.
You mentioned Lucio. I played Lucio at the Hampshire Shakespeare Theatre when I was in high school. And he is such an underrated character in the play. He's the only character who appears in every act of the play. And he is sort of the clown, but he's also the moralist in the play, or he's the one who's saying these morals are getting in the way of true justice.
One of the things I love about Lucio so much, sorry, Cara, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, one of the things I love about him, and I love about Barnardine, of course, is the way that they account for so much of the mess of the play. You know, that there's something so great about the way they refuse to listen to the Duke, the way that Lucio keeps interrupting in that final scene, the way Barnardine flatly refuses to be executed today. You know, there is something so brilliantly real in the way that Shakespeare executes this sort of escape plot, this extrication, that he encounters these parts of humanity that won't be subdued by the authority of a man in a cassock, that won't listen, that won't, and there's something, again, I think that's part of the whole movement of the play, which is to take account of the unbiddable in our lives, the unbiddable in our instinct, but also the unbiddable people. And Lucio is one of those great creations that's entirely unbiddable.
We have some more questions about Hamlet, lest we forget that other play. It's a good play. Marissa Canoodle asks, the Hamlet that leaves for England with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern is very different from the Hamlet we see in the graveyard. What happens? Two other questions about Hamlet. What does he mean by telling Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery?
Wow.
And from Peter Moskowitz, is Gertrude's account of Ophelia's death unreliable? Does it preclude suicide, the fact that she killed herself? So these are enormous questions that have plagued directors for 400 years. So Simon, can you solve them for us, please?
Yes, of course. Welcome to the Shakespeare Hour, everyone, where we solve the riddles that have haunted us all for centuries. And terrific questions. Yes, look, let's think about that. So, yes, Hamlet has changed. Yes, good. He goes to England with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and he's responsible basically for their deaths. And then he fights pirates, and he gets back on the right ship, and he comes back to Denmark. And when he comes back, he has this experience in a slightly kind of, you know, he's philosophical, but he meets the gravedigger, and he has a sort of interesting speculation when he is re-encountering someone he knew from his childhood that's died, Yorick, and that sort of gives him a kind of self-reflection. But then, surely this is what matters. He realizes that the girl, the woman that he's left behind, who he has loved in some way or another, is who's going to be buried in this grave. And it's the most unbelievable, life-changing shock for him that the person who's actually held up as being the person worthy of him in some sense, worthy of his love, has been destroyed. And I think
as a result of his actions, partly directly or indirectly, having killed her father.
Correct. But I think he has somehow justified that. But he hasn't seen the collateral consequences of that action until now. And I think it is that does something psychically to him, that he fights Laertes in her grave. It's this outpouring of feeling, of emotion, of non-thinking, visceral reaction, which in some ways clears something for him. He then disappears, and he comes back shortly afterwards in a very different state. And I think it is the psychic eruption in his mind of seeing up close and for real the death of Ophelia that sparks his transformation. Now, why does he say to Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery? Well, because I think by this moment he has discovered, because of course he's just heard that Claudius and Polonius are spying on him, because he says, where's your father? Which I think is prompted by a noise or a sense of going, he must be around somewhere. He's actually saying that, I think, out of love. Go away from this sordid, compromised, terrible, prison-like world. Go to somewhere where you are safe. And arguably, if she'd taken his advice, she would have lived.
Wow. What you mentioned, Simon, it's one of the great sucker punches in the whole canon. When we have the gravedigger scene, we have the speech about Yorick's skull, and then Laertes and Claudius enter with the body of Ophelia. And it's like, oh, we're in that scene now.
Yes. It's a great scene to work on. It's a great scene to direct. And not least because it goes right back to a question earlier tonight of going, how do you bring these different feelings, these different territories and genres together. And it's masterful because they arrive back from England and they're throwing the skull around, and it's funny. Like, oh, Europe, I knew this guy, he was a jester, I rode on his back, this is kind of, it's lighthearted, and we think, oh, this is the funny scene. And then tragedy arrives, and lightning strikes. And it's like this great visceral of Shakespeare shocking us, tricking us into this emotional rash. So it's brilliant writing. It's some of the best writing of the canon, I think. Even better than Motion Johnny.
Am I the only one here or out there listening to this who thinks he behaves pretty shabbily, not only in that scene, but throughout? To jump in your dead girlfriend's grave and protest that you loved her more than her brother, and then turn around to him after you are the indirect, as I said, cause of her death anyway, by murdering her father, who he seems to have no remorse for doing, just thinks he was a busybody, sort of a spy, bit pompous. There's no remorse. He shows no remorse about killing Polonius. And then to claim that he loved her more in that scene, in her grave, which I agree with you is the most extraordinary scene. But I've often struggled with loving Hamlet, loving him. And I don't mind a hero who behaves badly, but there are some ways in which the emphasis on his own feelings, his insistence that he is the only authentic feeler in the play, seems, madam, nay, is, I know not, seems. You know, this constant reminder to everybody of what a soulful dude he is in that particular scene, seems egregiously offensive to me. And then he has the gall to turn around to say to Laertes, why do you use me thus?
Well, before I answer that, Johnny, let's hear some, I'd love to hear some comments from our audience about that. Then maybe we'll hear Cara's reconciling point.
In fact, Amal Saad says, keep in mind, Hamlet knows about Polonius dying. Well, he knows that all of this is a result of Claudius's crime. So he blames Polonius's death and Ophelia's death on Claudius. But he is just...
I think if you were as a feeling a guy as he claims to be, you might have a little remorse at just killing someone you thought was Claudius, but is sort of just Claudius's guy. I don't know.
It's true that he does apologize to Laertes before the duel. He says, you know, I really crossed the
line. Cara wants to come in here. Cara.
We also haven't talked about the idea, because we were talking about like the fairies and ghosts being a real thing, but what about the humors? Like Hamlet's humors supposedly are, you know, like what we would call feelings, but he's so full of melancholy, he's so full of this, his internal organs, or the way that we would have described feelings being a more tangible physical thing through these humors, are literally so out of whack that it kind of, at least for me, it forgives a lot of bad behavior. Like if he's almost like bipolar is a really bad like analogy to that, I guess, or something, but he's purposefully so all over the place that I don't think when he reacts the way he reacts to certain things, I allow it because I just think that he's slowly falling apart.
And you know, we've gone this long and we haven't mentioned the madness in Hamlet, which is a huge part of the play. The ambiguity over his mental state. He says, I will pretend to be mad and therefore lure the king. But it's one of the unanswerable questions of the play, the strategic opacity, as Jonathan, you were saying, whether or not Hamlet actually does go mad at certain moments. And does he then regain his sanity by the end of the play?
Yes, and I think that I would argue tonight that what we've experienced through all of our descriptions of these characters is the shiftingness of our characters as they move from one extreme to another. And as Johnny, I think you're right to say, to suggest earlier, that Shakespeare is wary of fanatics. And I think he's taking extreme people and situations and working through them to show what's on the other side of fanaticism in different ways. And I think what for me redeems Hamlet is not his behavior, which you're right, Johnny, to question and challenge, but where he gets to as he dies, which is this, as we talked about with Antony, ultimately a recognition that the world is bigger than he is, beyond his control, and somehow is given by Shakespeare enormous poetry, which resounds ever since as a gift, which we can hold on to, much as we've decried or questioned his earlier behavior.
We have a few moments left in the show, so I do want to get to these speeches, which we put a pin in at the very top of the Shakespeare Hour. Jonathan, you said you picked one. Cara, you have your sides nearby.
Yes, let me find them.
And Simon, you've also picked one. Who wants to go first? Maybe Jonathan?
Sure. I suppose I was just trying to make a distinction between the way Hamlet talks about death and the way Claudio talks about death. The sense of the way the plays are different because of the urgency of time, but also, I would argue, the self-indulgence of feelings. Claudio is really about to die, and therefore he confronts the reality of death. I would say that Hamlet is in no danger of killing himself, and therefore can have a more Hallmark card version of what that might be.
Hater, still hating on Hamlet, Jonathan.
Here we go. To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. To die. To sleep no more. And by a sleep to say we end the heartache and the thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. So, as I said, I think there's a delusion there. Contrast it with this. This extraordinary, one of the great scenes in all Shakespeare, I think, when Isabella goes to Claudio and says, "Oh man, you're going to die tomorrow. I'm really sorry, bummed for you, brother, but there's nothing much we can do." And he says, "There's nothing you can do?" He says, "Well, there is something I can do. I could sleep with Angelo, but obviously I'm not going to do that." He said, no, you shouldn't. You definitely shouldn't do that. Should you?" And by the end of it, Isabella says, "What says my brother?" And Claudio says, "Death is a fearful thing." And Isabella says, do you remember, Cara?
No, I have to find a new speech because you chose
Don't
mine.
worry. Isabella says, "And shamed life a hateful." And Claudio says to her, by the way, bear in mind that the guillotine is coming down in a matter of hours. He says, "I but to die and go, we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot. This sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world, or to be worse than worst of those that lawless and in certain thought imagine howling. 'Tis too horrible." That seems to me a little less sentimental.
Wow, persuasive, brilliant, Johnny, brilliantly read as well. Cara, I think anything you want to
Well, I was going to choose that Claudio speech, but I would have read Hamlet's afterwards since it's so much nicer. I find it funny that Claudio decides immediately to get to like the 9th circle of hell. Like that entire speech is, not only am I dying, but I am dying and heading immediately to the worst of worst places. I do agree with you. I think Hamlet instead goes, "What is death? What is it?" Like, it's all about like, could it be like this? Could it be like that? But Claudio is pretty practical about where he's headed. Yeah.
Yeah, in some ways it's the grad student philosophizing about death in the dorm room.
Which is what, for me, that's what makes Hamlet a bit more interesting, because he's a bit like, as much as I have a feeling and as many times as I have seen it and we know where he's going, I don't believe that he's going there. When I watch it when I watch it again, the first few acts, I'm like, yeah, he's having a rough go of it, but I don't know if he's actually gonna die until he does. And it's because of speeches like that, where it's like, do I even dare to think about this? You know?
Yeah, it does. It always feels shocking when Hamlet dies, even though we know he's going to die. And I think it's because if there's a conclusion we can draw from this conversation, the slipperiness of character in Shakespeare. And I believe character is said for the first time in Measure for Measure, where Angelo says, my character is too rough to have this fine metal stamped upon it. Don't make me the Duke. I'm not cut out for this. And Shakespeare creates these characters that seem to live beyond the contours of the plays, which is why we're still sitting here in our houses on the internet talking about them more than 400 years after they were written. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for this week's Shakespeare Hour. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Cara, especially.
Thank you.
Yeah, well done, Cara. That's amazing.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great time.
And next week, the theme will be age and ambition.
Wow.
The plays are King Lear and the Scottish play. And we will be joined by Stacey Keach and Helen Carey. So please join us next week for that talk. And now we're going to sign off and wish everybody.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your great questions and comments. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being with us. And yes, check the website for more details on any of these things that we've talked about.